an understanding that there can be no greater relationship that between than that of neighbors, of people who have been put together not out of choice but by the will of God. In effect, we go back to normality, and our brothers and sisters from Somalia will be able to obtain their visas at the airport when they arrive.
On Monday, Jubaland forces and the federal government of Somalia forces clashed in Bulahawa, causing tension and fear to spill over in Mandera. Prior to this, 11 Kenyan members of parliament are said to have secretly visited Somalia, meeting President Farmajo, and upon their return were briefly questioned at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. All things considered, is it safe to say Kenya and Somalia actually do have a precarious relationship? I mean, the incursion of Kenyan forces into Somalia in October 2011 muddied the waters, and the maritime row dispute between the two countries seemed to have dented the diplomatic relations even further. It is true, we can't choose our neighbors, so we definitely have to coexist. But what is the state of this bi-relations between these two countries? That's the big story tonight in relation to what's happened over the weekend and what happened yesterday. We do delve deeper into this particular topic, just highlighting some of the nitty-gritty issues that need to be discussed. Welcome to the big story. Good evening once again. My name is Jesse Rogers. Let's get right into it. Let me appreciate our guest who's already in studio at our city center studios. That's Abdi Rashid, who's a Horn of Africa analyst. He'll help us delve deeper into this particular relations between Kenya and Somalia. But interestingly, our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, is set to have a conversation with the former member of parliament in Mandera, Abdikadir Mohammed, and it would be interesting to get his take on the state of affairs on the ground, what exactly transpired in Mandera as well. Over to you, Sophia.
Good evening, Jesse. So tonight on The Big Story, we are focusing on that firefight witnessed in Mandera County yesterday, a region that now has its residents fearing for their lives in terms of security going forward. And of course, a lot of what we witnessed is a spillover partly of what neighboring Somalia has been experiencing, and there are all manner of reports making rounds, and that attack or gunfight coming just days after those leaders, members of parliament, visited Somalia, and then they were questioned by investigators who are waiting for them at the airport. But let's talk a little bit more about what transpired there, and perhaps even the bigger picture, and going back over the years, what could have led us to where we are today. I have with me this evening Abdikadir Mohammed, who was President Kenyatta's constitutional advisor, but also a representative in the House for the people of Mandera for many years. Thank you for making time for us. Talk to me about what you make of what happened yesterday first.
So yesterday we had a very unfortunate set of incidents. For quite a bit of time there has been a build-up, for about a month or two. Build-up of forces, some belonging to the federal government of Somalia and others belonging to a regional government, the Jubaland government. Remember, the Kenya some time back pushed to have a buffer in Somalia and helped set up an administration along our border. The theory was that we would set up that buffer so that the problems spilling over from Somalia don't get us and are sorted at the buffer, and that we would then have KDF in there to see how that can be sorted. That was the plan. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And while there is an administration in Kismayu, the rest of the region, just like the rest of Somalia, is largely lawless. But right now, what we have new dynamic is that there's politics in Somalia, there's a presidential election coming, and there's a tussle between the federal government and that regional government. And Kenya, our country, is very much aligned to the regional government. So the fight was for the bordering town and who controls that bordering town. And the towns are like Namanga. So if you know Namanga, Kenya, and Namanga, Tanzania, that's exactly Mandera and Bulahawa. There's absolutely one large town with a demarcation in between. So the forces for this warlord who the federal government was chasing actually came from Kismayu and passed through Kenyan territory, was supported by the Kenya government and transported to Mandera. And then the allegation is that they settled within our border and were amassing there. And finally, when the attack happened, there's a claim that they were the ones who attacked, and there's a claim that they were attacked. But whatever happens, when the attack happened, the first fight was in Somalia. But when they were overpowered and they came back to where they were, those who were pursuing them crossed over with them. So there was also a fight on our side of the border. There are injuries, there are deaths, mostly of the combatants. There are vehicles burnt. But it's really a very terrible situation because, number one, Somalia has a lot of problems, and they have Al-Shabaab to take care of. The last thing they should be bothered with is fighting over who runs one town, whether it is the federal government or the regional government. So it's really not a very bright thing to be spending your effort there. But it's also it's really confusing for Kenya to be caught up in that situation. We have a huge issue with Al-Shabaab now on our side of the border. We have huge security problems. The last thing we need, other than the legality of it, is to be spending treasure and blood on a firefight between people who should not be fighting in the first place. So really it's a very unfortunate incident. Now for the people of Mandera, their leadership has been warning about this for the last 2 months. When this started, they called for press conferences. The Member of Parliament for Mandera actually asked for investigations by the relevant committees. They had a meeting with the President. They had a meeting with the security chiefs. And so it's really unfortunate that the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have brought us to this point. We have a big problem with Somalia. The last thing we need is to be getting entangled there or to be really part of the problem.
And we'll talk more about just what the whole situation in Somalia and it playing out in Kenya means. But a little bit on Mandera, because last week we had a show where I actually interviewed the governor of Mandera County, Ali Roba, and it was about the teachers that have been withdrawn, the non-local teachers by TSC, and how that was impacting on education. So that this just goes to compound a situation in a county that for a long time was marginalized, but then now all of these issues grappling with is the national government dropping the ball. And in your view, is there more power? Is there anything that can be done to the county government to enable them, perhaps in some sense, handle this better?
So the people of Mandera at this point in time really are feeling very let down by the national government. On the one hand, we can't have teachers serve because of not being able to secure them. On the other hand, you are supporting a warlord who is being chased out of his own country. And the firefight is happening within your territory. So that's why they really feel very bitter right now. In terms of the larger issues, education in northern Kenya has really come to a standstill. There are very few teachers, and not just education, but transportation also. We have huge problems in terms of traveling by road from one part of the county to the other. And then there are attacks. There are attacks just like they are in Lamu. There are constant attacks by the terrorists. So I think what the county, the locals, and the national government ought to do is come together to see how to solve this very difficult, intractable problem. You definitely need the locals to take their part, the populace to do their bit, in terms of reporting, in terms of supporting the security elements, in terms of doing their part of the lifting. But you absolutely need the national government to engage, not to throw up their hands in desperation. This is when you need real leadership. We need the political leaders, and to their credit, they have been very unified in pointing out this last bit. In terms of the teachers, I think it's really an education problem, and there's quite a bit that can be done. You can get, for example, quite a number of retired teachers, local retired teachers, who, if we cannot have that shortage filled, can be called on. you and I, probably you're quite a bit younger, but we used to have untrained teachers, and there are quite a number of young people who are not qualified, but can be used for untrained teachers. There are very many teachers serving within the county governments who can be seconded to the schools. Quite a bit can be done, but not just in education, in transportation, in security. We really need to come together as a country and focus on this. As far as Somalia is concerned, the problems in Somalia should remain at the border. If there's anything we can do, it should be a positive input like KDF is doing as far as AMISOM is concerned. The last thing we need is to be joking around it's really a very dangerous game to play.
Yeah. And you talk about the KDF in Somalia, and there are now conversations being reignited and debate around have we not been there too long? And is our presence in Somalia, even if embedded with AMISOM, helping at all? Or are the problems still there? So talk to me about, is it time to pull the plug?
So KDF and AMISOM were a godsend to Somalia when it started. You remember, Mogadishu was essentially a no-go zone before AMISOM went in there. But 10 years down the line, essentially the posture that those who are in the north say the forces are taking is force protection. There's very little getting done outside. If you went to Kismayo, I'm told 20 kilometers out of that city is Al-Shabaab country. If you looked at large swaths of the areas neighboring us, essentially under Al-Shabaab control. So time has come for us to and then now Al-Shabaab is on our side of the border. So if we were getting KDF to be the border and to face east, now the enemy is behind their backs. It is, at the beginning it was maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers from the border, but right now 60, 70, 80 kilometers into the Kenyan boundary, way into Mandera County or Wajir County or Lamu or Garissa. That's where the attacks are. And over the last 2 months, it has increased exponentially. So time to rethink, in my opinion, time to ask whether we would be better served by KDF on our side of the border. Time to have a very serious discussion with the federal government in Somalia if they have the wherewithal to supply troops all the way to Bulahao and have a firefight over Bulahao. Why can't they do that in terms of securing their borders? Time to have a regional discussion about AMISOM as a whole, because unfortunately sometimes you have a slippery slope where many of these forces come from countries that have poor economies, Burundi for example, where having these 5,000, 4,000 forces in another country and being paid for by UN is a way of keeping them out. So you really need to ask, what is the deadline? I know there has been a push to have that those forces reduced by the UN and those who pay for them. But that discussion really needs to happen as a country's discourse.
Yeah. And how would you describe the relationship between Kenya and Somalia now, at a time where we still have that maritime dispute? It's been ongoing at some point, serious worries on whether Kenya would end up landlocked if we lost that case. But in that, so we're there helping with the Al-Shabaab situation, but then there is this dispute, and then there's politicians like the ones we saw the other day visiting the country and meeting the head there. What is that relationship like in your view?
Right now, very bad, not very good at all. And actually, it's a shame that Kenya and Somalia should be at this point in time at the level where they are. Kenya has been very good to Somalia. We have hosted millions of Somali refugees. We have been a very good neighbor to Somalia. Somalia has been one of the largest problems we have had, security. It's probably the largest security problem we have had. The people-to-people relationships, excellent. There are 5,000 Kenyan non-Somali teachers in Somalia, serving in Somalia. If you go to Mogadishu today, almost all the hotels and restaurants, you'll get Kenyans working, Kenyans doing business in Mogadishu. So by all accounts, we should have a very excellent relationship. We don't. And I'm not even talking about the maritime boundary. That is a problem that is there, that's being handled at the court. But even without that, those little issues, really diplomacy has not been. We have a very, what would I say, shrill debate between Somalia and Kenya, and it should not be. We need each other. They absolutely need us. We need their support in terms of securing our. We should really not be pointing fingers or scratching each other's eyes. We should be sitting down like mature countries. I think our foreign ministry also is not helping. I think the foreign ministry has been missing in action for some time as far as the Somali file is concerned, and time has come for them to come up and say we need to do A, B, C, D.
What in your view would that be finally? What in your view would, if you were to advise the minister, CS Foreign Affairs, what would that advice look like?
So, for example, the issue of Mandera right now. What is so hard in even pushing for the administration of Jubaland, which we helped set up, and the federal government come together? This country has always been known as an island of peace. All those peace conferences, whether it's for Sudan or for Uganda or even for Somalia, took place here for a good reason. Because we were calm, we were very mature, we were always the adult in the room. We have become one of the combatants in the room, yes.
Okay. So in your view then, going forward, President Kenyatta, in these interrelations with Somalia, very much our neighbor, what is that thing that overall, because the buck does stop with him, should be done? So
President Kenyatta is highly respected in Somalia. The last time when the current president was being sworn in, I think after the elections, you should have heard the ovation he got in Mogadishu. He led when the first head of states meeting in Mogadishu since 1974 was as a result of President Kenyatta pushing very hard. Contrary to the advice he was given by our security agencies, he's highly respected. I think if the president came and called his colleague and sat him down. A president has a very good interpersonal relationship. If you have dealt with the president, he's a very warm person. He knows the issues very well. I think if the president got down to this and focused on this problem, it is not beyond him.
But he has not been able to deal with the maritime issue in terms of those conversations. It's escalated.
Okay, so the maritime issue is not an easy issue to deal with. The issues of Jubaland and stuff, in my opinion, are not difficult issues. But the maritime issue is a very difficult. What happens essentially is that the agreement we have with Tanzania in terms of how our border extends to the sea and the agreement Somalia has with its neighbors are contrary to each other. And in the process, that's where we are. Now, Somalia has a very huge coastal zone. We are not the first two countries to fight over our maritime borders. Cabinda was an issue. So I'm sure if we sat down and had that discussion, it's in the courts. Of course, the courts will decide, but ultimately we'll still be neighbors. The courts will not say, "Can you move away from each other?" Right. Even that. Look, the people sit and discuss and agree over issues that are difficult. If they are easy, you don't need to sit and discuss. Even where there are deaths, people sit and discuss and come to an agreement. Where there is a war, the Taliban and the US are sitting. After 18 years of the US saying we don't sit with terrorists. Yes, after we don't negotiate, people are sitting and talking. Ultimately, it will come down to Somalia and Kenya sitting down. Okay. Now, both countries are very nationalistic. The temperatures are very high. Our relationships are at the worst they have been for a very long time. This is the time leadership is called for. Leadership is not about doing easy things or solving easy problems. What ends up at that level are the most difficult of problems. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for making time for us here on The Big Story. Wakili there saying that this is a time true leadership must rise up, stand, take a position, but more so ensure all of this acrimony and the fighting comes to an end. And we will be watching events as they unfold. And I know, Jesse, the governor is set to also speak to us via phone about just what's happening on the ground from Mandera. Jesse.
All right, quite true, Sophia, and thank you so much for that short interview. We'll definitely get the sentiments of Governor Ali Roba on the state of affairs on the ground in Mandera County. But before we do, let me just get your quick reaction, Abdi Rashid, who's a Horn of Africa analyst. In terms of what's transpired in the last couple of days, you know, gunfire crossing over to Mandera County and having the 11 members of parliament from Kenya questioned briefly once they arrived back. What do you make out of all this? What is your quick reaction?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that these are not, easy, I think, categorization. Obviously, the timing of the MP's visit I think may have actually escalated the problem. But the Mandera tension has been brewing for a long time, and the crisis has been underway for a long time. I think there is a confluence of factors that have pushed us to this point where I think relations between the two countries are at their worst level in decades.
All right, now why do you think they're the worst in decades? Because Kenya has been instrumental in the stabilization of Somalia, or at least parts of it, ever since 2011 when Kenyan troops entered Somalia. Why do you think is a causative agent? What is causing this?
A number of factors. One, I think, is definitely the issue of Jubaland. Remember, the Jubaland initiative was largely, was the brainchild of politicians who are very much allied to the Kenyan government. And initially, when the proposal began, it was actually very much conceived in the city of Nairobi. Many of the meetings to create the Jubaland state were actually held in Kenya. And the perception was that it was entirely Kenyan-driven. Now, Kenya's strategic interest in Jubaland was very clear. It was basically to create a buffer zone within Somalia, which will allow, to inoculate itself from the crisis in Somalia, but also, eventually, it will allow the Kenyan government to begin relocating some of the refugee camps in Dadaab and elsewhere to safe zones inside Somalia. So there was a strategic, I think, aim behind creating a sort of safe, territory inside Somalia. Now, over the years, I think the Somalia itself was becoming a federal state. So there was an interest in creating a federal state called Jubaland. So there was, I think, a common interest eventually between the two countries to stabilize Juba. Now, the problem in recent, at least in the last 2 years, I think largely stems from, first of all, a deep antipathy between President Farmajo and President Madobe of Jubaland. I do not know the exact, cause of the, the deep animosity between the two men, but I think this is definitely one of the dynamics. But also, there is also, I think, another political element which I think the audience ought to understand, which is for a number of years, we worked on the assumption that Somalia was becoming a federal state and it was evolving towards a federal future. Under the current regime in Mogadishu, I think there is a fundamental shift in that perception. This is a government that has actually seized the federal project as basically not workable or not fixable, and therefore there is this growing attempt to re-centralize the country. And I think this is where the tension basically stems from. Madobe and some of his regional allies believe very much in the federal project. They want a sort of, greater autonomy because of, again, history of Somalia. Whereas President Farmajo and the federal government of Somalia believes in a top-down federal model. So there is that clash, I think, of power.
Okay.
And also the other problem, I think, which has to be understood is that the rules of the game have not yet been clearly defined. The constitution process is still, underway. So this, crisis between the Somali federal states and the central government in Mogadishu stem from the fact that the constitution review, which will have demarcated clearly powers and allocated resources, clearly has not been fully completed.
Okay, Rashid, so it's evident there are a couple of issues. First, from the administrative system and the ideologies based on the federal system of governance. But Irregardless, shouldn't there be a concerted efforts by these military forces, you know, the federal government of Somalia and those allied to Jubaland, and their loyalty towards fighting terrorism? Because I mean, once we see that two warring parties are actually fighting instead of concerting efforts towards fighting terrorism, doesn't this raise questions?
Obviously, I think this is a sad moment for not just Somalia, but for the entire region. I think no one expected people who are supposed to be on the same side, basically fighting each other. Now, you have to remember that the fighting in Kismayo comes against the backdrop of serious tensions in the Gedo region of Somalia. And this problem has been escalating for the last 6 months. First of all, the government of Somalia began deploying troops, specialized troops, about over 1,000 troops, some of them highly specialized troops, Turkish trained, were deployed to the region. And the initial assumption was that this force was being inserted into this territory with the aim of liberating territories which are still under Al-Shabaab control. However, eventually it became clear that these forces were also, I think the intent was also much to do with the politics. I think the current president, who has roots in that region, it has his eye on elections in 2021. And I think this show of military might was a way of co-opting the clans, but also asserting himself as a presidential candidate. So he wanted to take control of the region.
Okay, now we're in agreement, I think, till this point that the diplomatic relations between Kenya and Somalia have definitely seen better days. But let's take a look at something deeper. Is Kenya playing the big brother role a little bit too much? Are we crossing over into cases of interference in how Somalia is run? Would you say this is true?
I think one of the most fundamental, issues which no one can ever deny is that the prospect of a foreign army being in a country like Somalia will always be a source of tension and a source of problem. So even those who conceived of the whole operation to liberate Jubaland and Kismayo in particular, and the sacrifices that were made by the Kenyan military, I think the intent was never to stay there. And neither was the intent, I think, to become entangled in the domestic politics of Somalia. So the assumption was that it will be a go-in and a come-out, operation. It will not last, more than 1 or 2 years. But progressively, I think it became difficult for KDF to pull out because, again, the whole political project took very long, very many years to come together. There was a lot of infighting between the various clans and the various political factions. So stabilizing Juba politically took a long time, and that necessitated KDF's, stay. And then, Kenya became a very expensive operation, and that also explains why Kenya went and joined AMISOM. But to go back to your question, I think there is no doubt that the end goal of KDF and the end goal of Kenya must be to disengage from Somalia, to build a robust border defense, and then progressively to reduce its stakes in Jubaland. I think that must be the strategic goal. This country cannot afford to be in Somalia forever, partly because of the resources, but also the longer the Kenyan military and the more Kenya intervenes in Somalia, the greater the resentment that breeds. And also, basically Kenya plays into the hand of hardline nationalists who have always perceived Kenya as a predatory neighbor.
All right, many thanks. A lot has been discussed. Abdi Rashid, thank you so much for your input. Let's just take a short break. We'll definitely get back on this particular topic, just highlighting this tiff between Kenya and Somalia and what needs to be done to better the relations between the two countries. Later on, we'll be joined by Governor Ali Roba from Mandera County just to take a keen look on the state of affairs on the ground and perhaps get his input as well. Stay with the big story. We'll be back after this short break.
This is KTN News.